He was absolutely right to say that. And frankly, I think it speaks volumes that he can't sit in the shadow cabinet with the Leader of the Opposition.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the firefighters, mountain rescue services, police, armed services, engineers and workers of the Environment Agency and local government workers and all the volunteers for all the work they did in keeping safe thousands of people from the floods that have affected this country. In January 2014, following the devastating floods at that time, now 2 years ago, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "There are always lessons to be learned, and I will make sure they are learned." Were they?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me join the Leader of the Opposition in thanking the emergency services, the police, the fire service, also the search and rescue teams who went from around the country to areas that were flooded. Can I thank the military for all the work that they did? And as he says, what we saw was communities coming together and volunteers carrying out extraordinary work. Now, let me deal directly with this issue of lessons learned, because having seen my own constituency very badly flooded in 2007, having had floods while as being Prime Minister, I think a number of lessons have been learnt. This time, the military came in far faster than ever before. The Bellwin scheme was funded at 100%, not 85%. More money was got to communities more quickly. So a lot of lessons have been learnt. Are there more to learn? I'm sure there are. There always are, and that is why we'll review everything that's been done. But let's be clear, as we do that we will make money available because we have a strong economy to build flood resilience in our country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2011, a £190 million flood defence project in the River Aire in Leeds was cancelled on cost grounds by the government. 1,000 homes and businesses in Leeds were flooded in recent weeks. The government is still only committed to a scaled-down version of the project worth a fraction of its total cost, when the Prime Minister claimed that money was no object when it came to flood relief. When he meets the Leeds MPs and Judith Blake, the leader of Leeds Council, in the near future, or his Secretary of State does, will he guarantee the full scheme will go ahead to protect Leeds from future flooding?
Well, first of all, let me just make one point before answering in detail his points. It is worth putting on record, before we get on to flood defence investment, and I'll cover it in full, this was the wettest December for over 100 years, and actually in Leeds and in Yorkshire, it was the wettest December ever on record, and that's why rivers in Yorkshire, including the Aire in Leeds, was a metre higher than it's ever been in its history. Now, in terms of flood defences, no flood defence schemes have been cancelled since 2010. The investment in flood defences was £1.5 billion in the last Labour government, £1.7 billion in the government I led as a coalition government, and will be over £2 billion in this Parliament. It has gone up and up and up. And it's gone up because we run an economy where we're able to invest in the things that our country needs. And one more point. Let us not forget this. We inherited the Darling plan for our economy. That was a plan for a 50% cut in capital spending, and DEFRA was not a protected department. Well, we protected that flood spending and we increased it, something Labour wouldn't have done.
Mr. Speaker, of course the rainfall was excessive, of course the river levels were high, but the Prime Minister has still not answered the question on the Leeds Flood Protection Scheme. I'll give you an opportunity to do in a moment. In 2014, Cumbria County Council applied for funding for new schemes in Keswick and Kendal. Both were turned down. Both areas flooded again in the last few weeks. Does the Prime Minister believe that turning down those schemes was also a mistake?
We are spending more on flood defence schemes and are stacking up a whole series of schemes that we'll spend more on. But let me make this point to him. If he is going to spend £10 billion on renationalising our railways, where's he going to find the money for flood defences? The idea that this individual would be faster in responding to floods when it takes him 3 days to carry out a reshuffle is frankly laughable. Mr. Speaker, since I walked into the chamber this morning, His shadow foreign minister resigned. His shadow defence minister resigned. He couldn't run anything.
Mr. Speaker, it's very strange that when I've asked a question about Leeds flood defence, then on Cumbria flood defence, the Prime Minister still seems unable to answer. Can he now tell us if there is going to be funding for those schemes? In October, Professor Colin Mellors, the head of the Yorkshire Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, warned the government about funding cuts to flood defences in Yorkshire being formally discontinued in the future. Would that also be a mistake? Can the Prime Minister now tell us, is he going to reverse the cuts in the defences that have taken place to make sure that those cities and areas are protected in the next round of floods, which will no doubt come?
As I told him, we have increased and continue to increase the spending on flood defences. We're spending more in this Parliament, and for the first time it is a 6-year spending perspective, which is £2.3 billion extra on flood defences. Money that wouldn't be available if we trashed the economy in the way that he proposes. Now, of course, after every incident of flooding, you go back and you look at what you've spent, what you've built, you look at what you're planning to spend, what you're planning to build, and you see what more can be done. But the head of the Environment Agency was absolutely clear that he had the money necessary to take the action that was necessary. But we can only do that with a strong economy, an economy that is growing, where more people are in work, more people are paying taxes. We've got the strength to solve this problem of floods, and we will do it in a proper way.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister hasn't answered on Leeds, he hasn't answered on Cumbria, he hasn't answered on the warning from Professor Mellors. Like him, last week I met people in York who had been affected by flooding, and I met a young couple, Chris and Victoria, whose home had been flooded over Christmas. It wasn't very funny for them. This young couple lost many of their possessions: photos, children, toys, schoolwork, and they've got the foul stench of flood water in their homes, as many families have all over this country. They are asking all of us wholly legitimate questions. Why was it that the insufficient pump capacity of the Foss barrier, again alerted to in 2013 by a government report, was not dealt with and those pumps were not upgraded? Thus people were flooded in York and their possessions and homes severely damaged. Those people want answers from all of us, and in particular from the Prime Minister.
I have the greatest sympathy with anyone that's been flooded, and we have to do what it takes to get people and get to communities back on their feet, and that is why we put record sums in more quickly to help communities in Cumbria, in Lancashire, and now in Yorkshire, and we'll continue to do that. Specifically on the question of the Foss pumps, that was about to be tendered for extra investment, and that investment will now go ahead because the money is there. So what I would say to him, we're putting in the money, we're putting it in more quickly, the military got involved more quickly, and to that couple who got flooded, we're also doing something that previous governments have talked about but never achieved, which is to have an insurance scheme so every single household in our country can get insured. Flood Re. Now that's not been done before. So have lessons been learnt? Yes, they have. Are there more lessons to learn? There always are. But frankly, we don't need a lecture from Malta from the Honourable Gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that flood defence scheme after flood defence scheme has been cancelled, postponed or cut. Many more homes have been flooded, and too many lessons have been ignored. Why can't the Prime Minister support our calls for a coordinated cross-party approach to flooding that looks at everything, including upland management, to making people's homes more flood resilient and more protection schemes properly funded? Does the Prime Minister agree, at least with this, that the Fire and Rescue Service have done such a great job over the last few weeks in all parts of this country, should now be given a statutory duty to deal with floods to help us through any crisis that might occur in the future?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, the best I can say is when he's worked out how to coordinate his own party, then perhaps he could come and have a word with me. On the issue of a statutory duty, everybody knows what they have to do when floods take place. That's why there was such a magnificent response from the emergency services, from the fire services, from the emergency rescue services. They have our backing to do the vital work. And yes, we'll go on investing in flood defences. We'll increase the money we're spending on flood defences because we've got a strong economy and a strong country that can back the action that's needed.
The Deems are her way.
Mr. Speaker, 2016 sees us mark the 400th anniversary